February 19th, 1945, 4:30 a.m., off the coast of Iwo Jima. The sea is black and still. Then the horizon erupts. 16-inch naval guns from the battleships of the U.S. Fifth Fleet discharge in rolling sequence. Each blast tears open the darkness. Each concussion travels across the Pacific like a physical force. Shells weighing over a ton arc high into the night sky. Moments later, the island answers with fire, not from guns but from impact. Volcanic rock shatters. Sand explodes upward in pillars. Flame blooms across ridgelines. Inside reinforced tunnels beneath Mount Suribachi, Japanese infantry feel the earth convulse. Dust falls from timber supports. Air pressure hammers their ears. The sky above them glows white, then red, then white again. This is not the sporadic shelling they trained for. This is industrial annihilation, methodical, sustained, relentless. And for many of them, it is the first moment they understand that the sky itself has become a weapon. By late 1944, the Pacific War had entered a new phase. The Imperial Japanese Empire, which only 3 years earlier had swept across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific, now found itself compressed, retreating, and increasingly isolated. The victories that began with the attack on Pearl Harbor had expanded Japanese control across thousands of miles of ocean. But expansion had stretched supply lines thin, and American industrial mobilization was reaching full power. The United States did not intend to retake every lost territory. Instead, it adopted a calculated advance known as island hopping, bypassing heavily fortified positions, isolating them, and capturing strategically valuable islands that could serve as airfields and naval bases. The long arc of this campaign had already been written in blood at Battle of Guadalcanal and Battle of Tarawa. Each battle revealed a pattern. Japanese defenders would not surrender, and American forces would meet resistance measured not in hours, but in weeks. By 1944, the scale of combat had intensified. The U.S. Navy had grown into the most powerful maritime force in history. Shipyards across California and the East Coast launched battleships, cruisers, and destroyers at unprecedented speed. Aircraft carriers operated in task forces that could strike hundreds of miles from shore. Beneath this expanding fleet stood a logistical network capable of delivering ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements across the vast Pacific Ocean. Artillery, once confined primarily to land battlefields in Europe, had become an ocean-spanning instrument of destruction in the Pacific. American battleships, such as the Iowa-class vessels, carried 16-inch naval guns capable of firing shells weighing up to 2,700 pounds over 20 miles. These were not merely weapons of intimidation. They were precision instruments of calculated bombardment. Forward observers, naval fire control radar, and aerial reconnaissance allowed adjustments in real time. Entire ridgelines could be bracketed, corrected, and struck again within minutes. 4 Japanese infantry stationed on isolated islands. This represented a new and terrifying reality. The early Pacific battles had shown that beach defenses alone were insufficient. Mass machine guns and coastal artillery could not reliably stop a coordinated amphibious assault supported by carrier aircraft and naval gunfire. Japanese military planners began shifting doctrine. Rather than attempt to destroy landing forces at the shoreline, they would allow the Americans to land, then engage them in attritional warfare from fortified interior positions. The transformation was strategic and psychological. Instead of shallow bunkers and exposed gun nests, engineers carved deep defensive networks into volcanic rock and coral ridges. Tunnels connected command posts, artillery chambers, and infantry shelters. Reinforced with timber and concrete where possible, these underground labyrinths were designed to withstand aerial bombardment. The defenders would survive the initial storm, then emerge to contest every yard of ground. This doctrine was influenced heavily by the lessons learned during the brutal fighting at Battle of Saipan and Battle of Poliliu. On Poliliu especially, American forces encountered a defense-in-depth system that prolonged combat far beyond initial estimates. Japanese units, entrenched in caves and interconnected positions, resisted artillery and airstrikes with startling endurance. Yet something was changing. With each successive campaign, American firepower increased. Bombardments lasted longer. Ammunition expenditure grew heavier. Naval gunnery improved in accuracy and coordination. Radar-directed fire meant darkness no longer guaranteed concealment. Illumination shells turned night into artificial day. By the time planning began for the invasion of Iwo Jima in early 1945, the United States possessed overwhelming superiority in artillery, both afloat and ashore. Hundreds of naval guns would participate in preparatory bombardment. Marine Corps artillery battalions would land with thousands of shells ready for immediate deployment. 4 Japanese infantry assigned to defend these final outer bastions. There could be no illusion of relief. Supplies were limited. Reinforcements were improbable. Air support was nearly non-existent after the destruction of much of Japan's carrier and land-based aviation at Battle of the Philippine Sea. The defenders were instructed to hold, to inflict maximum casualties, and to die if necessary. The objective was not victory in the conventional sense. It was delay. It was psychological cost. It was demonstration of unwavering resistance. But doctrine could not fully prepare a soldier for what concentrated naval artillery would become in 1945. The Pacific Islands were small, confined, exposed. There was nowhere to retreat beyond the shoreline. No forest canopy thick enough to absorb sustained shelling. No mountains deep enough to escape concussion. When battleships fired in coordinated salvos, the impact did not remain localized. Shockwaves traveled through ground and air alike. Volcanic rock fractured unpredictably, sending splinters and debris into tunnel entrances. Air pressure surged through ventilation shafts. Men who had trained for bayonet charges and disciplined ambush found themselves confronting a force that felt elemental, like earthquakes summoned at will. The American strategy was clear. Before infantry advanced, the island itself would be shattered. And by early 1945, the next island in that sequence would be Iwo Jima, a small volcanic outcrop position between the Mariana Islands and the Japanese homeland, soon to become the proving ground for the most intense pre-invasion bombardment yet witnessed in the Pacific War. Iwo Jima was not large. 8 square miles of volcanic ash and jagged rock, crowned at its southern end by Mount Suribachi. To American planners, it was an airfield objective, a staging ground between the Mariana Islands and the Japanese mainland. To Japanese command, it was a forward shield. If it fell, American bombers would have an emergency landing site within reach of Tokyo. The island's defense fell under the command of General Tadamaki Kurabayashi. He understood something many officers before him had not. The shoreline could not be held against modern amphibious assault supported by naval artillery. The beaches of Tarawa and Saipan had already proven that exposed coastal defenses would be pulverized before they could significantly alter the outcome. Kurabayashi made a deliberate choice. He forbade the traditional massed banzai charges that had characterized earlier Pacific battles. He prohibited wasteful frontal assaults. Instead, he ordered the island turned into a fortress beneath the surface. More than 11 miles of tunnels were carved into volcanic rock. Artillery pieces were hidden behind steel doors that could open, fire, and close before counter-battery round arrived. Mortar pits were concealed in camouflage positions. Command posts were buried deep underground, protected from even the heaviest aerial bombs available at the time. Japanese infantry on Iwo Jima were not positioned to repel the landing at the waterline. They were positioned to endure the bombardment and bleed the attackers slowly. Yet, even this innovation existed within a growing imbalance. By early 1945, American industrial output had reached staggering levels. The United States produced not only ships and aircraft in unprecedented numbers, but ammunition in quantities that allowed sustained bombardment without hesitation. A single American battleship could fire more heavy-caliber shells in one day than many nations could manufacture in weeks. The preparatory bombardment for Iwo Jima began on February 16, 1945. For 3 days before the Marines landed, U.S. Navy ships shelled the island. Battleships, heavy cruisers, destroyers, each assigned specific sectors. Spotter aircraft corrected fire. Radar refined targeting in low visibility. To Japanese defenders inside their tunnels, the experience was cumulative. The first salvos shook the ground. The second shifted dust from the ceiling. By the third day, concussion had become constant. But here lay a crucial reality. Naval bombardment, though immense, was not omnipotent. Many Japanese positions were so deeply embedded that they survived the 3-day shelling. American commanders later debated whether the bombardment had been long enough. Some believed weeks would have been required to fully neutralize underground defenses. Still, what survived was not untouched. Ventilation shafts collapsed. Secondary entrances were sealed by falling debris. Communications lines were severed and had to be re-established under bombardment. Artillery crews waited in darkness for the moment the shelling would lift, knowing that once it did, the infantry assault would begin. The imbalance extended beyond firepower. American forces possessed coordinated arms integration at a level unmatched in the Pacific. Naval gunfire, carrier-based airstrikes, and land-based artillery were synchronized through centralized command structures. When Marines requested support, it could arrive within minutes. Japanese artillery, by contrast, was limited in both ammunition and flexibility. Guns hidden within tunnels had to conserve shells carefully. There could be no wasteful barrages. Each shot needed purpose. Counter-battery fire was difficult because American ships constantly maneuvered offshore, adjusting position. The psychological weight of this disparity was profound. Japanese infantry were disciplined, trained in endurance, and conditioned for sacrifice. But they were not immune to physics. A 16-inch shell did not require precision to cause damage. Near misses collapsed sections of rock. Overpressure alone could incapacitate men in confined spaces. The noise was not momentary. It was cyclical, rhythmic, inescapable. Night offered no sanctuary. Illumination rounds arced high above the island, suspended by parachutes, bathing terrain in white light. Movement became visible. Even concealed positions felt exposed beneath artificial daylight. The sky flickered continuously as guns discharged from sea and shore. And yet, despite all this, Japanese command maintained discipline. Kurabayashi issued strict orders. No premature engagement. No revealing positions during bombardment. The Americans were to be allowed ashore before full resistance began. The aim was attrition at close range, where artillery could no longer fire freely without risking friendly casualties. The defenders waited. They listened to the thunder from offshore. They felt the ground tremble with industrial power. They counted the intervals between salvos. When the Marines finally landed on February 19th, the bombardment lifted, and the silence that followed was as heavy as the noise that preceded it. It was in that silence that both sides understood the next phase would not be decided by artillery alone, but the memory of the sky ablaze would shape every movement that followed. Now the human, tactical, and technological dimensions of this moment begin to reveal themselves. For the Japanese infantrymen inside the tunnels of Iwo Jima, artillery was not an abstract military concept. It was a physical presence. Most defenders had endured air raids before. They had heard bombs fall. But naval artillery was different. It arrived with warning, the distant flash on the horizon, and then with impact so violent it compressed lungs and rattled bone. Concussion traveled through the volcanic rock like a living force. Men crouched against tunnel walls felt shockwaves pass through their bodies. Fine ash filled the air, turning breath into labor. Lantern light flickered. Timber supports creaked. The bombardment lasted hours at a time, sometimes days. Sleep came in fragments. Communication between tunnel sections required crawling through narrow passages clogged with debris. Medical care was limited. Casualties during bombardment were often not from direct hits, but from collapsing entrances, flying stone, and suffocation. Yet morale did not simply collapse. Japanese military culture emphasized endurance, gamen, the quiet acceptance of suffering. Soldiers were taught that fear must not show, that hesitation dishonored not only themselves but their unit and emperor. Letters written before the battle reveal resignation rather than panic. Many understood they would not leave the island alive. Still, training does not erase instinct. When the heaviest shells struck nearby, even veteran soldiers flinched. Heart rates surged. Some experienced temporary deafness. Others later described the sensation of the earth breathing, expanding and contracting with each impact. The terror was not theatrical. It was internal, controlled, silent. What made the artillery particularly unsettling was its impersonality. There was no visible enemy charging forward, no rifleman to aim at, only force from beyond the horizon. Mechanical, relentless, indifferent. Inside those tunnels, men realized something new about modern war. Courage could not repel gravity or overpressure. Endurance meant surviving until the barrage ended. And when the guns finally paused, a deeper tension settled in, because silence meant the enemy infantry was coming. The artillery that illuminated the sky over Iwo Jima and later Okinawa represented the peak of mid-20th century naval engineering. American battleships carried 16-inch/50 caliber guns capable of launching armor-piercing or high-explosive shells more than 20 miles. Each projectile weighed between 1,900 and 2,700 pounds. Upon impact, the explosive charge could crater reinforced concrete and shatter rock formations. But raw size was only part of the equation. Fire control systems had advanced dramatically since the early days of the war. Radar-assisted targeting allowed ships to maintain accuracy even in darkness or poor visibility. Spotter planes circled above islands, relaying corrections. Gunnery crews adjusted elevation and bearing with mechanical precision. Illumination rounds played a distinct psychological role. Fired high into the air, they deployed parachute flares that drifted slowly downward, casting bright white light across terrain. Defensive positions once hidden in darkness were revealed in stark contrast. Movement became risky. Shadows became traps. On Okinawa, which would follow Iwo Jima in April 1945, bombardments grew even more sustained. Naval vessels and land-based artillery combined to create near-continuous fire support. In some sectors, the night sky remained lit for hours, pulsing with muzzle flashes from ships offshore. The sheer volume of ammunition expended was unprecedented in the Pacific theater. American logistics allowed sustained shelling without immediate fear of depletion. Replacement shells arrived aboard supply ships in a steady flow. For Japanese defenders, this technological advantage was visible in the sky itself. The horizon glowed before each salvo. Tracer arcs marked outgoing fire. Explosions stitched across ridgelines in calculated patterns. This was not random destruction. It was systematic suppression. Artillery had become an instrument not merely of damage, but of environment control, shaping when, where, and how infantry engagements would occur. Naval artillery did not operate in isolation. Its effectiveness depended on coordination with ground forces. At Iwo Jima, the U.S. Marine Corps relied heavily on pre-registered fire zones. Maps divided the island into grids. Targets were cataloged. If Marines encountered resistance from a concealed position, forward observers could request immediate naval gunfire support by referencing grid coordinates. This integration was critical because Japanese defensive doctrine depended on concealment. Gun positions opened briefly, fired, and then sealed shut. Mortar crews displaced quickly within tunnel networks. Without rapid counterfire, such positions could stall infantry advances. The American system minimized that risk. Destroyers moved closer to shore to provide more precise fire once Marines were ashore. Field artillery battalions landed early, establishing beachheads from which 105mm and 155mm howitzers could operate. Naval and land-based artillery overlapped, creating layered fire support. Timing was deliberate. During amphibious landings, bombardment lifted minutes before assault waves reached the beach, a calculated gamble. Too early, and defenders could reposition. Too late, and friendly casualties could occur. For Japanese infantry, this coordination compounded psychological pressure. Even after surviving naval shelling, they faced incoming artillery from newly established American positions inland. The battlefield compressed. There was no prolonged recovery period between bombardment and ground engagement. Fire preceded movement. Movement triggered more fire. Every revealed position invited concentrated response. And yet, despite overwhelming firepower, the Japanese defense on Iwo Jima held far longer than American planners expected, suggesting that artillery alone could not fully neutralize deeply embedded fortifications. This tension between destructive capability and defensive resilience would reach its most intense expression during the coming climax of the campaign. General Tadamaki Kurabayashi understood the balance of power long before the first American shell struck Iwo Jima. He had studied in the United States years earlier. He had observed American industry. He knew the scale of production that stood behind every battleship offshore. When he took command of Iwo Jima in 1944, he did not promise victory. He promised resistance. Kurabayashi's orders were deliberate and restrained. There would be no wasteful charges at the shoreline, no early exposure of artillery, no symbolic gestures that sacrificed lives without tactical gain. His intention was to transform the island into a prolonged engagement, to inflict maximum casualties and delay the American advance toward Japan itself. This leadership approach differed from earlier Pacific battles, where commanders often emphasized immediate, aggressive defense. Kurabayashi emphasized patience, discipline, survival through bombardment. He ordered the tunnel network expanded. Artillery was concealed behind retractable steel doors. Communications lines were buried deep. Soldiers were instructed to conserve ammunition until targets were certain. But leadership also carried an unspoken truth. Relief would not come. The Imperial Japanese Navy could not challenge American sea control in early 1945. Air support was limited. Reinforcements were impossible once the invasion began. The garrison of Iwo Jima was effectively isolated. Kurabayashi communicated this reality to his officers. Letters sent before the battle reveal a tone not of delusion, but of solemn acceptance. The objective was not to survive indefinitely. It was to make the cost of capture severe enough to influence future American operations. Under sustained artillery, leadership required emotional steadiness. Orders had to continue despite collapsing tunnels and severed communication lines. Reports had to be delivered through darkness and debris. Officers moved between sectors under bombardment, maintaining cohesion. For the infantry, this discipline provided structure amid chaos. Even when the sky ignited and the earth convulsed, the chain of command remained intact, and that continuity would shape how the defense endured far longer than outside observers predicted. Iwo Jima's geography both shielded and betrayed its defenders. The island was volcanic, porous, uneven, composed of hardened ash and rock. This allowed Japanese engineers to carve extensive tunnels. Unlike coral atolls, which fractured under heavy bombardment, volcanic rock could absorb repeated impacts without complete structural collapse. Many American shells penetrated only so far before detonating. Surface positions were devastated, but deep chambers often survived. In this sense, terrain mitigated some effects of naval artillery. Yet the same terrain amplified concussion. Volcanic cavities transmitted shock waves efficiently. A near miss at the surface could send vibrations through underground chambers. Dust accumulated rapidly. Ventilation systems clogged. Heat built inside confined spaces. Above ground, the landscape offered little concealment once bombardment stripped vegetation. Craters overlapped. Ridgelines flattened. The once dark silhouette of Mount Suribachi became etched in constant flashes of impact. On Okinawa, where terrain differed, with more rolling hills and thicker vegetation, artillery operated at even greater scale. Their defensive lines stretched across natural ridges, and bombardments extended for weeks. The sky remained lit by naval fire and land-based artillery in near-continuous cycles. Terrain shaped the battle, but did not equalize the imbalance. Steel and explosives reshaped geography faster than defenders could adapt. By 1945, the Pacific War represented a confrontation between two forms of power. On one side stood industrial capacity, shipyards, ammunition factories, oil refineries, logistical fleets. American artillery barges were not simply military actions. They were the visible expression of a nation's economic mobilization. On the other side stood moral endurance, a doctrine rooted in sacrifice and persistence. Japanese infantry were trained to value resistance beyond survival. Surrender was culturally stigmatized. Defense until death was considered honorable. Artillery forced these two forces into collision. A shell did not recognize courage. It did not negotiate. It erased space with impartial force. Yet inside tunnels, endurance manifested in waiting for the barrage to lift, waiting for the moment to fight at close range. The psychological confrontation was stark. Industrial firepower sought to dominate from a distance. Moral doctrine demanded proximity, hand grenades, rifle fire, ambush. When the sky lit up over Iwo Jima and later Okinawa, it symbolized more than tactical preparation. It symbolized total war, where entire economies and belief systems were projected onto a few square miles of contested ground. And in February 1945, that confrontation reached its decisive intensity. The bombardment would not end the battle. It would only prepare the stage for its most brutal phase. The first heavy shells of the preparatory bombardment strike Iwo Jima. Battleships positioned offshore begin systematic fire against mapped coordinates. Cruisers follow, destroyers close in to shorter range. The sea, once dark and empty, becomes a moving line of gun flashes stretching across the horizon. For 3 days before the landing, the island is subjected to sustained naval gunfire. Ships fire in rotation to maintain pressure. Spotter aircraft circle overhead, relaying corrections. Radar refines targeting. The pattern is deliberate, methodical, not random fury, but calculated destruction. Mount Suribachi absorbs repeated impacts. The northern plateau receives concentrated fire. Suspected artillery positions are bracketed and struck again. Shells weighing over a ton slam into rock and reinforced entrances. High explosive rounds detonate with concussive force strong enough to flatten surface structures. Armor-piercing rounds punch deeper before exploding. Smoke rises in columns visible for miles. From the perspective of American planners, this is overwhelming force. Reports from reconnaissance flights describe widespread devastation. Observers see shattered ridgelines and collapsing bunkers. Some believe little could have survived. But beneath the surface, survival continues. General Kurabayashi's tunnel network proves resilient. Many artillery pieces remain intact behind steel doors. Communications are damaged but re-established. Infantry units huddle in deep chambers, enduring concussion and darkness. Casualties occur. Entrances collapse. Ventilation is compromised in sectors, yet the core defensive system remains functional. On February 17th and 18th, bombardment intensifies. Additional ships join the line. Ammunition expenditure rises. Some destroyers move dangerously close to shore to target cave openings at shorter range. American naval officers later debate whether 3 days is sufficient. Some advocate 10 days or more. Weather and operational tempo constrain the schedule. Amphibious forces are already assembled. Delay risks exposure to Japanese air attack, though such attacks have become rare after losses suffered in previous campaigns. By the evening of February 18th, Iwo Jima's surface appears lifeless. Craters overlap across the beaches. Black sand is churned and compacted by blast waves. Smoke drifts low over shattered rock formations. Yet silence is deceptive. Inside tunnels, Japanese infantry prepare for the moment the shelling lifts. Orders are clear. Allow the landing forces to commit fully before opening concentrated fire. Preserve ammunition. Target officers, radio men, and heavy weapons teams. The goal is attrition at close range. February 19th, 1945, 8:59 a.m. Naval bombardment begins to shift inland. Minutes later, the first waves of U.S. Marines approach the beaches in landing craft. The sea churns with amphibious vehicles and support ships. Aircraft continue overhead strikes. As the assault waves near the shoreline, the heaviest naval guns cease firing on beach sectors to avoid friendly casualties. The sudden reduction in concussion is striking. For Japanese defenders, this pause confirms the next phase has begun. Marines step onto the black volcanic sand. The surface, pulverized by days of shelling, proves unstable. Vehicles struggle for traction. Movement slows. For nearly an hour after the first landings, resistance appears lighter than expected. Some American units report minimal fire. Observers wonder whether bombardment has been more effective than anticipated. Then, at approximately 10 a.m., concealed positions open fire. Mortars drop on crowded beaches. Machine guns sweep landing zones from elevated positions. Artillery hidden within tunnels fires from previously undetected embrasures. The island that seemed neutralized suddenly reveals depth. Naval artillery resumes in support, but now with constraints. Fire must avoid friendly units already ashore. Destroyers provide close-in support, targeting visible muzzle flashes. The sky lights again, not as a preparatory storm, but as responsive fire. For Japanese infantry, the terror of bombardment transitions into direct combat. For American Marines, the assumption of shattered defenses dissolves into realization. The artillery had not erased the enemy. Instead, it had compressed the battlefield into a narrower, more lethal space. And as the fighting intensifies along the slopes of Mount Suribachi, it becomes clear that the true turning point of the battle will not be decided in the first hours, but in the sustained collision between firepower and endurance that follows. The first day at Iwo Jima does not end the way planners expected. By nightfall on February 19th, 1945, nearly 30,000 Marines are ashore. Casualties are already significant. The beaches remain congested. Artillery pieces are being dragged into position across unstable black sand. Engineers struggle to establish supply lines under intermittent fire. And offshore, the battleships are still there. Naval gunfire continues through the night, now in closer coordination with ground units. Destroyers edge toward the coastline, firing directly into cave mouths identified by forward observers. Illumination rounds drift downward, turning darkness into stark white light. The sky pulses rhythmically. Each discharge from a 16-inch gun produces a flash bright enough to silhouette ships against the horizon. Seconds later, impact flares across ridgelines. The island does not sleep. Japanese infantry inside tunnels experience a new dimension of pressure. During preparatory bombardment, the objective had been survival. Now, they must fight while bombardment continues. Every time they expose a gun port, counterfire follows. Every mortar launch risks revealing position. Kurabayashi's defense in-depth doctrine functions as intended. Units rotate through firing positions. Communication runners crawl through narrow passageways to relay orders when lines are cut. Counterattacks are limited and controlled. No mass charges, only calculated resistance. But American artillery expands. Once Marine howitzers are operational onshore, the island is subjected to overlapping fire from land and sea. High-angle artillery arcs into defilated positions unreachable by direct naval fire. Flame-throwing tanks approach fortified openings. Demolition teams move from crater to crater. The bombardment becomes layered. Surface explosions above, concussive waves below. Mount Suribachi falls on February 23rd. The iconic raising of the American flag marks a visible milestone, but does not end the battle. Northern defenses remain intact. The terrain grows more complex. Ridges, ravines, interlocking fields of fire. For weeks, artillery continues to light the sky. By the time organized resistance ends in late March 1945, nearly 21,000 Japanese defenders are dead. Fewer than 300 are captured. American casualties exceed 26,000, including nearly 7,000 killed. The scale of loss reflects a harsh truth. Even overwhelming artillery could not prevent brutal close-quarters combat once infantry closed distance. Yet the lesson is absorbed. When planning begins for the next major assault, the invasion of Okinawa, American commanders increase the scale of preparatory fire. March 23, 1945. Naval bombardment of Okinawa commences days before the landing on April 1st. This time, the armada is even larger. More than 1,300 ships participate in Operation Iceberg. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, rocket ships, and carriers operate in coordinated sectors. For 7 days before the landing, naval guns pound suspected positions. Minesweepers clear approaches under fire. Underwater demolition teams prepare beaches. The volume of shells surpasses previous Pacific operations. On April 1st, Easter Sunday, American forces land on Okinawa's western beaches. Initial resistance is lighter than Iwo Jima. Many Japanese units are positioned deeper inland along the Shuri defensive line. But as fighting intensifies in April and May, artillery once again dominates the environment. Naval gunfire support becomes nearly continuous in contested sectors. Field artillery battalions fire thousands of rounds daily. Illumination shells hang over ridges during night assaults. The sky flickers without pause. Japanese infantry defending Okinawa endure prolonged exposure to bombardment on a scale unprecedented in the Pacific theater. Unlike Iwo Jima, where tunnels were concentrated in volcanic rock, Okinawa's terrain includes limestone ridges and complex cave systems. Many positions survive initial shelling, but repeated strikes collapse sections over time. Concussion fatigue becomes a documented condition among both defenders and attackers. Men experience headaches, temporary disorientation, ringing ears. The battlefield becomes a landscape reshaped hourly by explosions. The decisive shift during Okinawa is not a single dramatic moment. It is cumulative exhaustion. By late May 1945, the Shuri line collapses under relentless pressure. Japanese forces retreat southward, still resisting but increasingly fragmented. Artillery follows, adjusting range, advancing methodically. The psychological weight of sustained bombardment compounds attrition. Units cut off from supply endure shelling without reinforcement. Command structures degrade under constant pressure. When organized resistance ends in late June, Okinawa has become one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers are killed. American casualties exceed 49,000, including more than 12,000 dead. Civilian losses are catastrophic. The sky that lit up over Iwo Jima had become a sustained inferno over Okinawa. And by the summer of 1945, the implications were unmistakable. If this level of artillery was required to capture small islands hundreds of miles from Japan's mainland, what would be required to invade the home islands themselves? That question would shape decisions in the months ahead. Decisions influenced not only by strategy, but by the memory of skies turned permanently to fire. When the guns finally fell silent over Iwo Jima in March 1945, the island no longer resembled terrain. It resembled the surface of another planet. Craters overlapped in dense clusters. Ridge lines had been shaved down by repeated impact. Steel and concrete lay twisted among volcanic ash. Yet as American units cleared the last tunnel complexes, one conclusion became unavoidable. Pre-invasion bombardment, though immense, had not eliminated the defensive core. Nearly 21,000 Japanese defenders had occupied Iwo Jima. Fewer than 300 were taken prisoner. The vast majority fought until death inside the very tunnel networks designed to survive artillery. Many positions remained functional long after naval fire ceased. Some artillery pieces, protected behind steel doors, were only destroyed by close-range demolition teams. For American commanders, this reality forced reassessment. 3 days of preparatory bombardment had appeared overwhelming. Battleships and cruisers had fired thousands of heavy shells. Carrier aircraft had struck repeatedly. Yet deeply embedded fortifications endured. Historians later debated whether extending bombardment for additional days or weeks would have significantly altered the outcome. Some naval officers argued more time would have neutralized additional positions. Marine commanders countered that intelligence on hidden tunnels was limited. Shells cannot destroy what they cannot locate. The casualty figures weighed heavily. American forces suffered more than 26,000 casualties on Iwo Jima, including nearly 7,000 killed. It marked the first Pacific battle in which total American casualties exceeded Japanese. Though the island's strategic value as an emergency airfield for B-29 bombers proved real in subsequent months, the human cost shaped strategic thinking. Then came Okinawa. Between April and June 1945, the battle escalated beyond prior Pacific engagements. The scale of artillery, naval and land-based, surpassed even Iwo Jima. Continuous fire missions supported infantry pushes against the Shuri Line and southern defensive pockets. And yet, despite prolonged bombardment, resistance persisted for nearly 3 months. American casualties at Okinawa exceeded 49,000, including over 12,000 dead. Japanese military losses surpassed 100,000. Civilian casualties reached catastrophic levels. Estimates range between 100,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians killed amid crossfire, forced conscription, and bombardment. Artillery proved decisive in breaking defensive lines, but not in preventing prolonged combat. Tunnel systems and cave networks again demonstrated resilience. Firepower could shatter surface infrastructure, but underground resistance required close assault. The psychological toll extended beyond immediate battle zones. Reports from medical officers described cases of combat fatigue intensified by constant artillery exposure. Prolonged concussion, sleeplessness under illumination rounds, and relentless vibration created stress conditions among both sides. The battlefield environment itself had become oppressive, shaped by fire to such an extent that recovery between engagements was minimal. At the strategic level, planners faced a sobering projection. Intelligence estimates for a potential invasion of the Japanese home islands, Operations Olympic and Coronet suggested far greater resistance than Iwo Jima or Okinawa. The Japanese army retained millions of personnel on the mainland. Civilian mobilization programs prepared the population for defense. Tunnel construction and fortification expanded across Kyushu and Honshu. If small volcanic islands required weeks of artillery and tens of thousands of casualties, what would be the cost of mainland invasion? Naval gunfire and aerial bombing would be larger still. Industrial capacity could sustain it, but geography and population density would magnify destruction. The aftermath of Iwo Jima and Okinawa thus became more than casualty accounting. It became a calculus of endurance versus annihilation. Artillery had demonstrated overwhelming physical power, yet it had also revealed its limits against deeply entrenched, determined defenders. And as summer approached in 1945, American leadership confronted a narrowing path forward, shaped by the experience of skies lit continuously by gunfire. By July 1945, the Pacific War had entered its final stage. The fall of Okinawa placed American forces within 350 miles of the Japanese mainland. Airfields on captured islands supported continuous bombing operations. Naval fleets operated with near-total control of surrounding seas. Yet what lingered in military briefings was not only confidence, it was caution. The experience of Iwo Jima and Okinawa had demonstrated that Japanese defensive doctrine had evolved effectively. Tunnel networks, reverse-slope defenses, and carefully timed counterattacks had prolonged both battles despite overwhelming artillery support. Naval gunfire could devastate terrain. It could isolate sectors. It could suppress visible guns, but could not fully eliminate a deeply embedded, disciplined defense before infantry engagement. Planners analyzing potential invasion scenarios projected unprecedented casualties. Operation Olympic, scheduled for November 1945, targeted Kyushu. Operation Coronet, planned for spring 1946, aimed at the Kanto Plain near Tokyo. Intelligence assessments estimated hundreds of thousands of American casualties in the worst-case projections. Japanese losses, military and civilian, would likely be far higher. The artillery required for such operations would surpass even Okinawa's scale. Battleships would shell coastal defenses for extended periods. Carrier aircraft would strike transportation networks and fortifications. Land-based artillery would move inland as beachheads expanded. But the geography of the Japanese home islands introduced new complications. Mountainous terrain offered natural defensive lines. Urban density increased the risk of civilian casualties during bombardment. Underground facilities were already under construction. The lessons of Iwo Jima had not been ignored by Tokyo. Engineers expanded tunnel systems along expected invasion corridors. Civil defense units prepared for sustained bombardment. In American strategic discussions, artillery alone no longer appeared sufficient to guarantee a swift conclusion. Simultaneously, the U.S. Army Air Forces intensified strategic bombing of mainland cities. Incendiary raids devastated urban centers during the spring and summer of 1945. Industrial output declined sharply. Infrastructure fractured. The cumulative effect of naval blockade, aerial bombing, and battlefield attrition constricted Japan's capacity to continue war. Then, in August 1945, a new weapon entered the calculus. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th introduced destructive power beyond conventional artillery or air-delivered ordnance. Though fundamentally different in scale and mechanism, the strategic logic connecting earlier bombardments to atomic deployment was direct. Reduce projected invasion casualties by compelling surrender through overwhelming force. Japan announced its acceptance of Allied terms on August 15, 1945. In retrospect, the skies lit by artillery over Iwo Jima and Okinawa represent a transitional phase in modern warfare. They marked the apex of conventional naval bombardment as a preparatory instrument for amphibious assault. They also revealed the staggering human cost when industrial firepower confronted entrenched resistance. For Japanese survivors, the memory remained physical. The vibration of rock under shell impact, the glow of illumination rounds through tunnel entrances. For American veterans, the memory included the realization that even days of bombardment did not guarantee minimal resistance. Military doctrine evolved accordingly. Post-war amphibious planning incorporated longer reconnaissance periods, improved bunker-penetrating munitions, and refined coordination between air, sea, and ground forces. The importance of intelligence regarding underground defenses became paramount. But the most enduring consequence was psychological. The Pacific War's final battles demonstrated that total industrial mobilization could project destruction at unprecedented scale. Yet victory still required infantry advancing across shattered ground. And when peace arrived, it did so under the shadow of skies once illuminated not by stars, but by artillery fire sustained through nights without darkness. The war had ended, but the meaning of those illuminated skies was only beginning to settle into history. The skies over Iwo Jima and Okinawa had become something more than battlefield illumination. They were a testament to the scale of industrial warfare, to the raw capacity of nations to project power across oceans and onto small, rocky islands. Each flash, each explosion, was a reminder that technology had outpaced traditional notions of courage and fortification. Yet beneath the firepower, the human story endured. Japanese infantry huddled in tunnels, facing incomprehensible force, clinging to discipline and endurance. Marines struggled through ash-choked beaches and cratered ridgelines, absorbing shockwaves that shook the body and spirit alike. Survival was measured in inches, in moments of breath, in the courage to move forward despite devastation surrounding every step. The battlefield became a crucible where industrial might met human resilience, each testing the limits of the other. Strategically, the battles revealed a truth about modern warfare. Sheer firepower could shape the battlefield, but it could not replace the necessity of human engagement. Even the most calculated bombardment could not completely eliminate hidden defenses or moral resolve. This reality influenced subsequent planning, including the consideration of the Japanese home islands, and eventually the decision to use atomic weapons, an extension of the principle of overwhelming force, amplified to an unimaginable scale. In the end, the illuminated skies stand as both a symbol and a warning. They symbolize the destructive power humanity can unleash when technology, industry, and strategic intent converge. They warn that courage, ingenuity, and human endurance endure even under relentless fire. And they remind history that war is never merely a contest of weapons. It is an encounter of will, resilience, and the cost of choices measured in human lives. The fire may have ended, but the echoes of those skies continue to shape our understanding of courage, sacrifice, and the extraordinary consequences of industrialized war.